I mean, thankfully, Ben and I both worked on the first one. We were both concept art directors and sort of the, right-hand guys to the production designers. And so it was thankfully a fairly logical step, and we were familiar with the world. And like the last film, we, divided the work, but instead of sort of virtual versus, practical sets, we did it more just philosophically of like divide by culture. So I was all things Pandora, Navi creatures, the biomes, everything that comes from that moon. And Ben was all things Earth, all the, tech and vehicles and architecture and all that stuff. So that was sort of step one. It's kind of divide that up. But then it was, to answer, it was a monumental task. And I think I can speak for Ben that it was exciting and incredibly intimidating too, because like it was not just one Avatar film. We're talking about 3 or 4. And so, we didn't just design this one in a vacuum. We were spending a lot of time developing the broad stroke design for the whole saga.
In the early process, it's not as if we walked onto the job and there were already scripts, right? There were already writers. There was already a writing process that was going on between Jim and a team of writers, a little more like TV than like a typical movie script writing process. But as they were discovering the story with Jim, and he, of course, had gone off and written 1,500 pages of notes. So it's not like he came to it with no ideas, right? He had ideas for them. He had lots of ideas for us. But they were cracking and discovering the story and how that would all work and which characters were really going to work and what their journeys were at the same time that we were starting to explore the world, it was twofold. It was the first thing was like, oh God, we have to fulfill, the quality level that's expected of the first movie. Dylan has to create elements of a planet that people will fall in love with the same way that they did again, da da da. But on top of that, then it was the realization when we were coming into it with no information that, oh no, like this is a much bigger story. It's a much bigger world. And kind of there's crazy shit, to pardon my French, that's going to happen and that we have to design for. So it was, I guess at a certain point, it luckily jumps from the intimidation factor of, oh God, how are we going to do this, into the fun factor of like, wow, we get to explore so much. We have so many places we're going to go. And even to a small extent, we can influence the story because there were illustrations and designs we did or things we had conversations with Jim about that actually impacted what happens in the film, which is a designer's dream to be such a part of the collaborative team at that point in the process.
I thought it was exciting because, unlike other, science fiction franchises, Pandora isn't, oh, it's the jungle planet, right? Which is what a lot of people probably assumed watching Avatar 1. But, Jim really wants Pandora to be a metaphor for Earth. And so we get to see that Pandora is just as diverse as Earth. And that was really exciting. And so, it wasn't limiting at all. We're like, okay, that's the rainforest section. We're going to go to the, tropical island section. And, Jim has teased some of the other places we're going to go in the future. And I don't dare repeat because I like my job. And, and so, so we get to explore all that variety. So it was just a matter of travel, and it was written into the story like they journey. You're like, cool, that's easy, So let's go explore somewhere else. So it's sort of like there's waves. There's waves of just the pure world building stuff where we'll have these big conversations, and we'll talk about what the geology would be, what the weather systems would be, the biomes, how each culture would adapt to all these different things. And that's great. And that lays the foundation. But ultimately, when you're shooting on the day, and if whatever that set piece doesn't work to tell that story, that'll change on, instantly, because you're making a movie. So what you're trying to do is lay the foundation with the world building in the best possible way you can, just to tee yourself up for success. And then once you understand those rules, and you try and adapt and change, hopefully within those rules, to serve that story.
One of the things that other creative franchises deal with is the endless potential. When anything can be anything, you can kind of go off the rails, right? And this is true for any creative person doing any kind of project. If you don't have limitations on what you're doing, it can be a much more stressful process, and it can lead you into strange, unsuccessful places design-wise, right? The nice thing about working with Jim on these movies is that not only do you have the story constraining your work and guiding your work, right, as Dylan said, but you also have the underlying scientific principles of reality to help constrain you, right? And this is true on the nature side. It's true on the technical side as well. Jim is a highly technical person in the way he thinks about stuff. He calls himself a frustrated engineer. He has a science background. He's ramrodded these amazing science related activities into his personal life by inventing submarines and going to the bottom of the ocean and other little things like that. So he brings so much to the table and knowledge. And he basically, expects the team to take that spirit and run with it, of always doing research, always trying to understand why something is the way it is, as opposed to just falling in love with a visual, and thinking, oh, this will be cool, right? Being cool is good enough for a lot of other projects, but it's not good enough for Avatar. And so, working within those constraints is great. So, when Dylan is looking at new areas of the world, he's looking at real reference. He's looking, even when there's something that's specifically Pandoran and crazy that you want to do, it'll be based on a Pandoran scientific principle that's been established. Would you say that that's true, Dylan?
100%. It all starts with reference, and we might recontextualize something where we'll take a microscopic piece of fungi and, oh, that's a tree now, at least as a jumping off point, because I would say nature's the greatest designer, and like we're not going to conquer or best in an afternoon sketch what has been evolving for millions of years.
On the technical side, you can imagine that this applies as well, right? So all of our tech needs to fall into certain technical conceits that were partly established in Avatar 1 and now expanded upon, right, of what the RDA's tech can and cannot do. But even when we invent new things, like Jim came up with the crazy idea that one of these ISV starships is going to come right down to the planet and burn the hell out of it to create a landing zone and then drop the seed of a new base right in the middle of it, right? That's a crazy, really epic visual concept for a film. It's a cinematic idea, but it's also incredibly engineer mind, right? And so that's the sort of spirit that Jim brings to it, and then we run with that and try to engineer all those elements that make up that system to look really well considered, and at the same time to have a visual reference, kind of metaphorically, to things that you want it to remind you of, right? So when that module comes down, it's like an office building meets an oil rig. So suddenly you've got like an office building on Pandora, and that's a visual, and it's got these big legs and it's orange, right? This industrial color reminds you of a different type of extraction process that we see on Earth that we haven't referenced before. So even on the technical side, there's the technical accuracy, and then there's the metaphorical references to real things, that gives you an emotional element too.
Yeah, I mean, AWA is of course always an important theme and always in the back of our brains, and so we just approached it in kind of in a similar way, in that a lot of our coral structures, Jim wrote very early on the phrase the fractal reef. We're like, ooh, what does that mean? and it was a great way of nodding towards intelligent design with the mathematics of fractals and all that stuff, so that it's not overt, but we certainly reference a lot of Mandelbrot fractals in some of our large arcing coral shapes. And so that was one way that we were trying to show everything being connected, and that some of those coral shapes are sinuous and arching and kind of connect similar to the roots of the forest. That was a very conscious thing. And then, of course, there's the underwater spirit tree. We see at the Cove of the Ancestors. You see, that huge, it's kind of this underwater tree, but then you see the root system going out, very much the exact same as the Tree of Souls from the first film. And then of course we have the big kelp forest during the third act battle. And while it was very frenetic and actiony, that is actually literally connected in this net-like web of structures. That was another very, very conscious thing. But and then of course all the marine life, right? That just connects it all. But the main way that influenced the architecture is that concept of a network. Connectivity is a massive theme in Avatar, and so Jim just wanted a village suspended under these roots and referenced tensile architecture, and it was like, okay, cool, go, right? Oh, okay. And so there was a lot to explore, and then we did many iterations on exactly what that language is. But then we were looking at just a lot of classic tensile architecture, including like architect like Fraiotto that did the Munich stadiums and stuff like that, and that was like kind of the biggest, grandest tensile stuff we had seen. And so that certainly influenced some of the form language. But it's sort of like what Ben was saying is having a problem. Is like all good design is a good solution. So you need a problem to have a solution, right? And so that problem was we have roots and we have water. Go. And then that's where you just lean back into themes. And so the theme of the connectivity, like, okay, great. So if you bounce on a walkway, you'll feel it 3 doors down and all the all the all their homes. And so and it was just conceptual things of like not thinking like a city street where it's like, nope, there's a street and houses. Like, no, it's all the same thing. Like the walkways are the tensile supports for the marui, which is our term for their dwellings and stuff. And so it was about figuring all that out on a conceptual level. And then once you have kind of a basic language, just drilling down into the details and how a Navi would actually how it would be woven. And it was just it was an iterative process over years to develop that, because in the first film we didn't really see architecture. We saw they lived in home tree. We saw some totems and some hammocks, and that was about it. So this was a much broader exploration of architecture. I mean, we really had a lot to figure out. The coolest thing that we did is once we had designs that we thought were successful. We're again, it's that National Geographic, James Cameron level of realism. So we knew, like, we wanted to practically figure this out. And so we had a workshop and worked with them to create a large miniature or a bigature, that 14-foot tall of the Sully home at Metcaina Village. And it was all made out of bent cane, woven flax, different ties and all traditional techniques. And it's like when you think you have a design, we might have 80% of a design until you figure it out for real. And that was just amazing, because that became a study model for what effects that did the all the final visual effects. They photographed and scanned that, and that influenced the entire village in the way all those connections work, and just the reality and the layering that you get, and you just can't fake that.
The look of Avatar 1 was maybe more explicitly straight concrete brutalism, right? The look, it was leaning into bunker looks. It was leaning into the brutalist architecture of the world that obviously takes kind of World War II bunker motifs and makes them into a style, which is a great look, and it conveys the kind of the dominant kind of cold quality of the RDA as they start to take the planet, and literally a bunkered attitude, right? Of building walls, building fences, protecting yourself from nature, demonizing the natural world so that you can justify yourself to go destroy it, right? All the psychology of domination and colonialism is kind of represented by some of those things. Anyway, I would say maybe we leaned into something that's more like industrial brutalism this time around, leaning more to the industrial side. And particularly when you look at how industrial equipment relates to water in the real world, you start looking at giant work ships, you start looking at oil rigs, you start looking at huge cranes that operate in a marine environment. Every single one of these things almost has bright colors in it. Right. So suddenly for the new movie, I wanted to, you don't want to make everything super happy, colorful time, Teletubbies, but leaning into bright color as an element of industriality that could give it a different flavor, could pop better against water colors, right? Remind us of these maritime things that are from our Earth reality. And so examples of that would be trying to introduce pops of color in and amongst the largely gray architecture at Bridgehead, our new human base. So I mean, and especially as we get closer to the water, stupid little detail, but as you're coming out of the sea gate, which is one of the big openings to let the Sea Dragon out of the ship to go on its mission, the Sea Dragon being the giant 400-foot long kind of hydrofoil wing and ground effect craft that goes Tolkien hunting. I wanted to make sure there was some color there. So the gun towers that are near that gate are bright orange, right? As if it's a color that you paint it with this like crazy strong marine paint, and you're constantly repainting it because it rusts, and so to remind you that it's a water adventure that you're about to go on to. And then in the Sea Dragon itself, it's a gray ship. Right. It ended up being a little more silvery than I even expected in the final shots in certain lighting conditions, but it's fundamentally a gray ship. But when it opens, right, its guts are red, right, which simultaneously evokes these kind of like heavy safety-oriented industrial environments, like on oil rigs and stuff, and looks kind of like a creature opening its mouth, right? Because we think the insides of mouths are red, or the organs of a creature inside are red. So you're seeing into it, and it suddenly feels like it's a feeding orifice, not just a mechanical thing opening, right? So, and I think the other influence that we had going to the ocean was to try to embrace ocean shapes, even in the technical things, right? So super obvious example is the crab suit, which ultimately, after all this exploration of different sort of layouts for it that were a little more anthropomorphic or a little more centaur-like, and that it was kind of like a human upper body parked on a more insectoid, multi-legged lower chassis. Ultimately, Jim just said, you know what, guys, I think we're thinking too hard. It's a crab suit. You guys need to look at a real crab. You know, the amazing job that evolution, as Dylan was saying, that evolution does in design. That, not only is the whole thing, every shape in it is hydrodynamic, but the way that the shapes fold together and it can collapse on itself forms additionally hydrodynamic shapes, right? I mean, hey, I've got it right here. Why should I talk instead of using a demonstration model? Um, so the way these arms, right, become the leading edge of this hydrodynamic shape when they fold up into it, right, is something that we drew from real crabs, but that we even leaned into farther than nature does sometimes. And once you start thinking of these things as crabs, then you come up with new functional ideas. They can tuck in their legs. They can use the little feet that we put on the ends of the limbs to grab the kelp as they're moving around. And you see that when they're chasing the kids in the movie, right? That they're kind of clawing their way through the environment. It became much more fun. And of course, anytime something reminds you of an animal, it's sort of, you have a fun emotional reaction to it. And circling back to the sea dragon, we looked at manta rays and whale sharks for that, right? Because we wanted to, when you see photos of whale sharks, which are perfectly harmless to humans, right, next to scuba divers, the look of that mouth is still scary as hell, right? So that shadowy, wide aspect ratio mouth that's somewhat common to whale sharks and to manta rays was something that we wanted to get into that, and the sea dragon has one.
For the underwater creatures, so much of it was just about sheer quantity. Besides the hero stuff you mentioned, like Skinwing and Tolkien, it was just sheer quantity. Like, we had to populate an ocean, and Jim wanted this level of biomass that hasn't existed on Earth since prehistoric times, when there was like 10 to 20 times the amount of life in the sea. And so create that density. You're like, oh, we'll make like a dozen fish, it'll be fine. And then you like start to see they like, oh, okay, we need a lot of species. So I mean, we did over 100 fish, over 100 pieces of coral, and so many different things. But it's hard because hydrodynamics are hydrodynamics, and so what cuts through the water is a torpedo, basically. And that's why fish look the way they do. And so we were trying to look at other ways of locomotion besides just like typical like bait fish style thing. We were looking at rays and nudibranchs and jellyfish and anything that moves by other means. But the skimwing is my personal favorite, and that was basically, Jim's like, nope, it basically works like a flying fish, but it's a warrior's mount. We're like, oh, okay, fun. And so we kind of knew what the body mechanics were going to be, but just wanted it to be aggressive. So you give it this black and orange paint job that's going to pop over the cyans of the oceans, but then for a while we were thinking of it as like an evolutionary jump from the oceans to the Ecron. And so it had much more of a Banshee Ecron type head. But between what we were doing with the Elu and the Ecron already, I was like, come on, we just got to do something cooler. We got to do something different. And so I kept pushing to more of a longer snout. And originally I was thinking more like a marlin or sailfish type snout, but we knew it had to be stronger and grab. And then okay, well, so we started looking like crocodilian stuff, and then like the gharial crocodilian species. And then of course, in typical Jim fashion, he shows up next day. Oh, by the way, I have this skull cast of a gharial. And so I was like, oh, of course you have this. And so that became this reference for our creature designer, Zach Berger, just to like start sculpting from it. And so that was great. But it was one of the challenges. You're also it's almost like vehicle design. Like it's like you're designing a motorcycle. So you have to deal with like the ergonomics of how you're sitting on that thing. So we might have a great creature design, but until we build a practical buck and we put a rider on that, we don't know it's going to work. So we'll then move fins, we'll move wing insertion points and all that stuff so that it works ergonomically with the rider and the performer. So the design is always evolving, per each level of production. we did scouting and we did build the sets, and that but a lot of times it's done in a different fashion. And so I think the important thing is that even though we were realizing it with a lot of visual effects, it's still very much the philosophy of a live action movie. And so take something like any one of the random jungle shots. Okay, that like it's like, oh, it's a jungle, great, go do it. But no, that is built as it's a virtual set that like, okay, I'm going to do a jungle layout and I'll plan where, okay, I think the action could be here, here might be your hero angles. Then we literally go scout it with Jim on the virtual stage. So with sometimes it's with like our stand, like our troupe, which are just like our performers, not our main cast, or sometimes we just call it chess pieces, where it's just like static figures in the environment, just they have someone to frame on virtually. And then we literally go virtually scout the space. And Jim will shoot in a completely different area, or like, okay, this works, or he'll want to change stuff. We change stuff on the fly, or he'll just go off in the weeds and no, this is where I want to be. Like, oh, okay, I got to build out that area. And then, so then that will lead to our performance capture sets, but that also the exact same process, I'll let Ben speak to that, is what's done for our practical sets as well. And I think there's a huge misconception that it is all CG, but we did monstrous set builds. And even for the, for the visual effects virtual stuff, it's all about, as building. If you're not building the set, build reference bits. Like also I talked about that miniature. We also built a chunk of walkway. There were many samples. There were they were ripping up greens to scan and like bark textures to scan and all that. So it's grounded in reality as much as possible. And like one of the best examples are the costumes. Deb Scott and her team at Lightstorm and what a workshop built every single Na'vi costume practically, just so that they could understand it, scan it, and so that's the philosophy here.
They often would take those costumes and do water testing on them. So what does it look like when water flow blows against them, right? What does it look like when someone swims downward versus upward? All that stuff becomes invaluable reference for visual effects. And I think that the realism of the film has so many elements to it beyond good simulation, right? It's so many elements to it that are being driven by this obsession with practicality and using the real reality whenever we can.
In production design, I like to think of it as the broader sense. It is world building. It's not just set building, and so that's where I like the term, pixels or plaster. It's all design, and so I think, we are not, we are freed. Some people view visual effects, production design, you don't get to build as much. I view it the exact opposite. I have the biggest canvas there is, and can literally create and design anything that can serve the story, and it can be realized. And so I care less about how it's realized, more about the design and how it serves the story. I think you hit it on the head. I mean, it's about very relatable family story, right? That is very human. And so we had to approach design in that same way, that everything happens. It's 9-foot blue people on an alien world, but somehow it's about our family and what we do here on Earth, right? And so we had to approach it that way, where like if we did truly alien design, where you might have gelatinous blobs in a methane fog or whatever it is, like that no one's going to relate to that, right? So in order to get that human story, you have to accept the world, and it can be beautiful and wondrous and exotic, but it can't be off-putting. It still needs to be aspirational. It needs to be somewhere that you want to go, want to experience, and most importantly want to save, because that's ultimately that's what they're doing. And so you take that mentality, and then ideally you like reflect that back on how we are treating our own planet with it. And so we can only accomplish that if it was relatable enough. I think that was one of the biggest challenges on my side, is that like the target is just a feeling that Jim has that is right. And so trying to get in his head and figure that out. But yeah, ultimately that's why it's like, we're just like, oh my God, does water, like, does water react differently? Like, what is sand? What is rock? What is coral? And so we've had to answer those basic questions and look to Earth and just, Ben was talking about the metaphor, and it's always, what is the metaphor? And of course, obviously the oceans are the oceans. And so we had to do the exciting Pandoran amped up version of that. But ultimately it is a beautiful, dramatic reflection of Earth that you can relate to, or if not, the story just wouldn't work.
You have mentioned how the humans are the bad guys, and that is absolutely true. But I think it's the exceptions that give you a little bit of an insight, right? And even building some sympathy for the mindset of the bad guys was important for me to design their world. So who are the humans that are not the bad guys, right? It is always scientists in the story, right? Whether it's Garvin, who obviously has huge misgivings about what he's doing to the Tulkun in Avatar 2, or Grace and all the other rebels, from Avatar 1, Max and Norm. It's always the people who are interested in studying the culture of the planet, interested in seeing like in the way that the Na'vi, I see you, right? They see nature for real, and strangely, it's technology that allows them to do it, right? That Jim has explored kind of the relationship between technology and human life, and is it good or bad? Is tech good or bad? In many of his movies, I mean, we all know how awesome it was that he took the Terminator, and in the second movie, he made it Terminator into a good character, right? That was very deliberate, and it's a really great twist on that keeps you reevaluating this idea of is tech good or bad for us? And I would say that the technology gives an insight into things, and for these scientist characters, because they see the beauty of Pandora, because science reveals it to them. They understand what the forest is doing because they've studied it, because the holograms show the energy flowing from the trees into the ground and into the next tree over. And through those graphics, which are very deliberately designed to be beautiful for the audience, that's another lens through which the audience can actually respect and fall in love with the planet. But when you look even at the bad guys, the sort of new redoubled effort of kind of a corporate profiteering machine, right? To find it, they found a new resource to exploit on the planet, which of course is the Amrita and these poor Tulkun creatures. How do they think about themselves, right? When you look at from history, if you look at any of the bad guys of history, not one of them thought they were the bad guy from their own point of reference, right? There's often a propaganda element to these kind of dominant cultures, totalitarian societies, etc. So this is like a slick corporate version of Nazism or Stalinism or like these other things. So what does that look like, right? And so even though there's not an explicit attempt to show Earth propaganda or culture in that way, I had to find ways that the designs that I did have to tell to tell that cultural story, right? So that sort of high performance cruelty, the excitement that people feel to get out there, and in their minds, they're not attacking Pandora, they're saving Earth. Literally, their mission notion in their head is completely opposite to what we in the story perceive it to be. So the designs and the feel of the RDA stuff had to reflect that.